脸书的独立监督委员会尚未对是否恢复特朗普的账号作出决定，而推特已经决定永久封禁特朗普的账号。3周前，推特表示将推出 Birdwatch 新功能，允许用户对误导性信息进行审核，目前正在试用阶段。而在华盛顿，国会两党也都提出了废除230条款，停止保护社媒平台对用户言论免责。在社交媒体时代，如何保护言论自由？如何应对误导性信息？今天3位法律、民权、网络领域的专家对这个问题进行解读。1月6日，美国国会大厦被特朗普支持者闯入后，社交媒体公司推特宣布永久封禁特朗普。特朗普4年里发出36000多条推特，拥有8800万关注者。他曾在推特上公布政策、开除官员，也直白地表达对某些人物和事件的个人喜恶。推特封杀特朗普引起了有关言论自由、内容监管等问题的讨论。今天，3位美国法律、民权、网络行为方面的专家一同探讨社交媒体时代的言论自由。
First of all, it's important to note that as a legal matter under U.S. constitutional law, Twitter's banning Trump does not violate the First Amendment. I think that it did the right thing at the beginning, taking intermediate steps. So not taking the tweets down, but flagging them and giving other information, because some of his tweets were violating Twitter's rules against misinformation about the election and the electoral process. In terms of, whether I think it's a good idea, I think Twitter may well be justified and its decision reasonable in light of the extraordinary events of January 6th at the Capitol.
Yeah, I am not a believer that individuals should be banned and censored in that kind of way unless they do something absolutely outrageous that nobody else happens to be doing on the platform. Because if you start selecting out some people to be banned and others not to be banned, the question arises, you're either going to remove everybody who's saying anything, in which case, why even have a platform? Or you unfortunately you just have to let these things go.
So right now, the problem with Section 230 is at least the way that the courts have interpreted it. It's been read for these platforms to essentially do whatever they want, engage in as much reckless practice as they want in order to increase engagement or to get profits and not have to worry about any kind of liability or negative consequences that may result. And that's really unusual because we normally expect that let's, for instance, think of a brick and mortar business or a newspaper or really any intermediary we can think of that's not an internet intermediary would have some responsibility for at least some of the harms that are very predictable and foreseeable and that a company could easily do something about. And so right now we need to switch over that kind of immunity that the tech industry has and make it a little bit more like what every other business offline would have to contend with, and to think about and anticipate the kinds of harms or the kinds of injuries that could result from reckless practices.
I think if there were an attempt to make that into a law, a federal law, that it would almost certainly be struck down by the Supreme Court. And that is because of this longstanding view that companies like Facebook and Twitter have their own First Amendment rights to decide which speech they want to carry or not. Meaning, so Facebook could come and say, you can't, as the government, require us to carry the accounts of people who we think have violated our rules because we don't, so we don't want to carry their speech. And I think that they would probably win on that in court. And I also think it's probably would be a bad idea for the government to try to regulate. It's also hard to see how they could implement rules that say you can only ban this but not that. It just seems like a big mess.
I don't think you want governments going in there and doing this because then, well, even if they do it well, there'll be the natural opposition to saying this is government control. Social media don't really have the job of correcting people and behaving like a news media source. They're providing spaces where humans can get together in a virtual world and talk and associate around interests that they have and buy things and sell things. That's really why they're there. So there is a meaningful engagement, again, as to, well, how might the algorithms be modified to give them a more balanced view? But the trouble is that that's almost asking a social media company, which is a business. In the end, it's a business. It's asking it to be a social engineer. So I think much more the debate is how are platforms going to engage with, given that they have community, given that they promote groups, after all. That's what they do. They promote communities. So how are we as society going to deal with the fact that there are meaningful communities online? And what are we going to, what are the rules of engagement socially, not legally, but socially?
1月6日，美国国会大厦被特朗普支持者闯入后，社交媒体公司推特宣布永久封禁特朗普。推特封杀特朗普的决定引起了有关言论自由、内容监管等问题的讨论。今天我们邀请3位嘉宾：奈特第一修正案研究所律师凯蒂·法洛、乔治华盛顿大学物理学教授尼尔·约翰逊、迈阿密大学法学院教授玛丽安·弗兰克斯，一同讨论社交媒体时代的言论自由。
Of course, there are going to be then consequences, just as if you ban someone from driving on a certain road at a certain speed, they'll use another road.
Right.
They'll go somewhere else. They'll find another solution. They won't suddenly think, oh, you're right. I shouldn't be saying those things. I'm going to stop. Unfortunately, the closest analogy that I can think of is the problem of having bugs infestation in your yard. If the solution is not just to take care of the largest yard in the neighborhood, because all the bugs will just go to neighboring yards. And online, every yard is a neighbor of another yard. And so you're just going to have this problem of just pushing the problem into other platforms.
And in the case of Trump, even when his account was suspended, he still had the ability to get his message out through, he's the president of the United States. He could have plenty of media attention on television. He has other outlets. I'm more concerned from a free speech perspective about people who have less power being deplatformed and having no other, real ability to get their message out.
Anybody who is trying to argue that platforms need to have equal sides for certain topics, or that they need to amplify certain speech even if they don't want to, that completely violates the principle of the First Amendment itself, because these are companies that are private entities that have their own rights of free speech, which include, of course, the right not to speak and the right not to host certain types of content and the right not to have their property used in a way that they find objectionable. So we need to really ignore and really, I think, repudiate those kinds of ideas that are actually advocating in some ways for more suppression of speech and for some really directed governmental control of speech. We need to reject all of that.
I think it's much more important and much harder, but much more important to look at the communities of people who believe the same thing as the person who's speaking. The person who's speaking tweeting may be the most famous, maybe the one that everybody notices, but they are in a community of some kind. And that is it's the community, like the bugs in the yard. You would never contract a company that just goes around stamping on each one of the bugs one at a time. You really have to understand where they're forming a nest, how their access points are. Why is it that they're attracted into your yard and not the neighbor's yard? What is it about your yard? What really needs to be understood is what's going on in the communities and how are they talking? What questions are they asking? What are they talking about? Who are they also connected to? And the idea is not to then remove them, but to somehow understand why they're there. Unfortunately, it's kind of a society issue. So I could imagine community groups working with online communities that are closest to their interest in some mix of real world and online mediation.
Well, I think I'm encouraged by some of the steps that some of the private companies are taking to try and implement transparent policies and rules that explain to people what their rules are and trying to set up a system that operates as kind of like a quasi-judicial forum for assessing whether, for instance, a particular account should be left up or not. So, for instance, Facebook has established this thing called the Oversight Board, where if it determines that it's going to take down or take a negative action against an account, that person can refer, or I don't know who refers it, but basically can be reviewed by this Oversight Board, which is compiled of people who have a lot of expertise and international expertise in speech. I think the other way would be to encourage diversity and more options for social media platforms. You know, you could have, platforms started by a nonprofit but that's hard to do, of course, scaling it up technically. But if it could be done, I think that would be helpful.
But even those who are happy about the fact that these platforms are finally putting in some regulations should be concerned about the fact that this is completely dependent upon these companies' feelings at the time, and that they could just as soon roll them back and they can change them at any point. And so if we are really concerned about the role that social media platforms play in this kind of violence and disorder, there's going to need to be some actual legislative reform that is something that puts in place a permanent structure or permanent incentives for these companies to do the right thing